So now I'm going to hand things over to our presenters today. We have Laura Flynn, CQL Quality Enhancement Specialist, as well as Elizabeth Seitz, CQL Director of Organizational Excellence. Laura, Elizabeth, it's all yours.
Thank you, Seth. Well, welcome, everyone. We are really excited to talk to you about rights today. Like Seth had said, my name is Elizabeth Seitz, Director of Organizational Excellence, and my co-presenter today.
Laura Flynn, Quality Enhancement Specialist.
Okay, well, let's get right to it. Thank you, Laura. Okay. So, we always like to start by talking about CQL's vision and mission. And our vision is a world of dignity, opportunity, and community for all people. Our mission is that CQL is dedicated to the definition, the measurement, and the improvement of personal quality of life. Almost 500 organizations across the United States, Canada, and Ireland have achieved accreditation with CQL. This covers 25 states in the U.S., including the state of Tennessee's Department of Disability and Aging System. There are many benefits to a partnership with CQL. Most importantly is its positive impact on people and on the workplace. Now, CQL accreditation also provides accountability for progress, improved services, resource sharing, and external validation of the good work being done, among lots of other things that you can see here on the slide, including appreciative inquiry and access to the personal outcome measures, alignment of values, lots of data, strategic planning, and assistance in developing quality assurance and quality enhancement structures within an organization. Now, as we begin today, we just want to share a reminder. At one point in time, we were all taught a certain idea about the rights of people with disabilities, what used to be considered best practice. Today, we are going to be talking about consensus best practices at this moment in time. This conversation is not a criticism of anyone. It is not intended to chastise. It is a conversation about recognizing the opportunities that we all have to update our skills and learn from each other. Because when we know better, we can do better. Now, what I'd love for you to do, if you want to, in using the Q&A box, is to put in there what having a right means to you. Okay. So we know this means something different for everyone. So we'd love to hear from some of you on what having a right means to you. And while we get some of those in, Laura, would you share what it means to you to have a right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really good question to start off the reflection of this whole webinar. To me, having a right is something that you're entitled to. Something like freedom of speech. It's something that others are obligated to respect.
Hey, great answer. Thank you, Laura. Um, to me, having a right really means having a freedom to do something, something I'm entitled to do, and it shouldn't be taken away from me for just any reason whatsoever. Now, looking at our Q&A box, we've got some great things in here. So we've got a right is a moral claim that stands even when it's unpopular. Knowing I am safe to share my thoughts, contribute to community, and exist in a safe world. We have independence, freedom to make choices about my own life, something that cannot be taken away or removed. To me, having a right means I can be who I am. It means freedoms. Someone else says, I feel like having a right means I get to make choices for my own body and my own life. Other people say the ability to make a choice, to make decisions about my life choices, and the option to exercise something I want to do. Lots of answers that speak to freedom and choices. Absolutely. Overwhelmingly in the Q&A box, it talks about freedom and choices. So thank you everyone for sharing in there what you did. This was fantastic. Now, let's give some other definition of rights. So, a few other definitions of rights include having a right to something means possessing a justified, legally or morally protected claim to hold, act, or receive something without interference. It is a power or privilege held by individuals, groups, and entities, usually as the result of a constitution, statute, regulation, or judicial precedent. And ultimately, in essence, having a right means you're entitled to it. It is protected, and interfering with it is considered a violation of legal or moral rules. It is a moral or legal entitlement to have or obtain something. So, why are rights important? Well, they're essential because they protect fundamental human dignity, freedom, and equality, ensuring people can live without fear of tyranny, abuse, or discrimination. There are some key reasons why rights are important. They include protection against abuse, which is important to everyone, extremely important to people with disabilities who unfortunately see abuse at a much higher rate than the general public. Another key reason rights are important is because they ensure basic needs and dignity. And if you remember from our vision and our mission at CQL, dignity is a key word in that. Also, it promotes equality and freedom. And today we're going to talk about how people with disabilities are people like everyone else. They are equal. There is no difference. So, rights are important because they promote equality and freedom. They're also important because of empowerment and social justice, and for limiting authority. And what I mean by that is it places obligations on said authority to act in ways that respects people. Okay, so that's just something that I want everyone to remember. When we talk about limiting authority, it places obligations on that said authority to act in ways that respects people. I'm now going to hand it over to Laura to begin sharing some of CQL's observations on rights.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, so first I want to talk a little bit about policies. And so policies are important not only because they outline, the commitment to upholding rights, but they specify exactly how that will be done. So solid rights policies are descriptive and they focus on people. Just like Elizabeth just said, it's about people's human, civil, and legal rights, not just their service rights. Solid policies also provide a robust outline of how rights are both promoted and protected. Sometimes we see that organizations can focus really heavily on the protection side with very little or no mention of promotion at all. So it's important that there's a balance of both of those included within policy. So speaking to the protection side of rights policies, it's important that rights policies reference the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the Constitution rights of the country in which people reside. It's also important that rights policies focus on for protection, focus on education. So educating people receiving services about what their rights are, of course, but also, and of course, also in ways that are accessible and understandable to them, but not just what their rights are, kind of what a restriction means, what examples of that might look like, what the due process procedures are. And this includes what limitations are around payees and guardians. And similarly, education for all staff at all levels within an organization. Again, not just what people's rights are, but how those restrictions and due process play out, what those systems look like, how if someone's rights are going to be restricted, what processes need to happen, and really making sure that that understanding is robust for staff. Some examples of really great policies will underline having systems to inventory all of the rights restrictions that are in place at an organization. So having that data and why those restrictions are in place, because then you can start to look at removing those in a systematic way and really having a baseline for where things are at. Another great example could be, we've seen organizations take this kind of into their processes and for incident reporting, having a part of the incident report that speaks to, was somebody's right restricted during this incident? And then if it was it authorized, was it not? And having the supervisor follow up with them to really facilitate that ongoing deep understanding of what restrictions are and what needs to happen. If a restriction is in place, just really bringing up that level of confidence and understanding for staff. Another aspect that, of course, is very, very important within rights protection is how does somebody report a violation of their rights? So this, of course, applies within the organization. So how does somebody make a complaint or a grievance if they had a rights violation? But also really wanting to consider how this applies to external entities as well. So if someone's rights are violated at the doctor's office or at their place of employment, what resources are available to the person to handle that situation and report that? But then also how are staff supported and trained to support somebody through that process? And then lastly, on the protection side, of course, rights committees are very, very important. And CQL has done a lot of webinars about this, but really clearly outlining and defining who's a part of that committee, how are they trained, what are their responsibilities, looking at all of those individual restrictions, but also policies that might restrict people's rights. Incidents of abuse or neglect, things like restraint, all of those rights violation complaints. And then how does the committee provide feedback and suggestions to the organization about that? And then how often they meet. So again, just really important that these are well described and very, very thorough and robust. And then on the other side, like I said, really making sure that there is a balance about promotion. This is a very impactful area. So the first part being discovery. Describing within policy what tool is used to understand what rights are important to people and what supports they want or need to exercise those rights. This often will look like a rights assessment, but just describing what that is and how often it's used with people. Also, again, going back to the education on the promotion side, looking at accessible, understandable ways for people to have ongoing learning about what their rights are. For services like early intervention, this might in policy be spelled out like how parents and families are going to be provided with information about their rights and their child's rights as they enter the school system. Or another great example here would be outlining in policy what the system is for where plans and documentation is about people and how people are given access to that system. So having their own login to view that information. And then also having the option to have accessible and understandable plans in formats that make sense for them. And then again, of course, education for all staff is very, very important here. And really going beyond just what are people's rights, but how staff are trained to support them to exercise their rights. So kind of, because learning about rights is different than how do you support someone to exercise them. So really giving concrete examples and how people are trained in that way. Another important area within rights promotion is health advocacy. So having a clear policy on what best practice health interventions are followed for all people, regardless of disability. So essentially, what the organization's commitment is to providing equal access to healthcare, because we know that unfortunately people with disabilities do not have equal access to healthcare. And so how is the organization going to ensure that that happens? And another example could be a system to review the benefits and risks of health treatments, regardless if a person has a guardian or not. Of course, in rights promotion, this is another area that really should be defined in policy how the rights committee is going to promote rights. So describing in what ways that they do this. Maybe they're partnering with the self-advocacy group at the organization to identify common concerns or complaints that are coming through, and then working to have, you know, plain language resources developed for people to learn about and prevent those types of concerns from happening with their rights. And then lastly, advocacy groups. So really outlining the commitment to describing how people are supported to learn about, get connected both internally and externally, and to join advocacy groups. So overall, having, like I said, a balance of both promotion and protection within policies is very, very important. Strong rights promotion can help to reduce the need for rights protection, but both are needed, of course. Including elements of promotion are very impactful. So very important to think about that. And then it's also important to kind of zoom out and look at all policies and procedures with a rights-focused lens to ensure that there are no items that are restrictive within other policies. So this sort of brings us to the next area, which is looking at systems and procedures. At CQL, some of the common areas that, as we're going through things with accreditations, we might discover restrictive elements, and common areas include money. So things like people having to ask permission to use their own money, or staff holding on to it, having to get receipts of all their transactions, having to use cash instead of a card, maybe having places that they're not allowed to spend their money at. And oftentimes what happens when we start to kind of dive deeper with organizations about this, we learn that maybe these systems are more set up for staff accountability or protection from staff because of maybe a reaction to a situation that happened previously, but really not about the individual needs of the people that are being supported. So really encouraging organizations to look at what are the individual needs of the people being supported, and maybe rather than money being locked up and having receipts and having it being counted several times a day, could the person manage their own money without staff involved and eliminate the need for that system altogether? And of course, something I just like to say here is having realistic expectations in this area too is very, very important. Sometimes we kind of have these overly high expectations of people that have disabilities and need support that isn't really realistic for any of us. So I don't think most of us budget up perfectly 100% of the time. So not having that, high threshold for them to meet, but really just realistically looking at what does a person need in this area? And again, using systems of discovery to learn about their financial literacy, their desire for money management, and how they can acquire those skills and be more independent in that area. Other systems that we sometimes come across are that related to money specifically are, if somebody has a rep payee in place, sometimes organizations will, as part of the system, pay people's bills or spend their money without talking to them, without talking to a person and informing them about where their money is going. So really thinking about having sound procedures in place to make sure that financial transactions are discussed with people prior to that money being spent. In things like employment settings, thinking about that level of true discovery and exploration of what people want, rather than plugging them into maybe a place where there's an opening, right? Really looking at How can someone be supported to do what they want to do and discovering that with them versus kind of, oh, this is something that we know they have the skills to do. They could be, someone who um, sweeps the floor. So we have an opening here. We're just going to plug them in. Really looking at that deep exploration with people. Um, Also might see things like rules that might exist in employment settings, like people that receive employment supports can't leave for lunch breaks, even though other people are allowed to, or don't have the same access to benefits. So just reviewing those systems and ensuring that people have the same access to all benefits. So if an employer provides PTO, health insurance, access to an employee assistance program, wellness program, things like that, that people that have support with their employment also have those benefits. Some other common restrictive systems that come up more in residential scenarios are around visitors. So are there rules or policies in place that say that people can only visit at certain times, that people have to ask permission for visitors? Are they allowed to have overnight visitors? What does that look like? And are there rights similar to what rights we have around visitors? So really exploring that. And then lastly, just want to talk a little bit about some other areas like rules that might be put in place. So things like rules around like people aren't allowed to hug one another or loan items to one another. And so really just want to encourage organizations to kind of step back and think about rather than having a rule about that, could there be a focus instead on education around boundaries and addressing individual situations that might come up with that? Because obviously those things might cause issues, but addressing those on a case by case basis and then providing learning and education about boundaries because there are certain social situations for all of us where it is appropriate to loan somebody an item or to give a person a hug. And so when rules are created across the board, you're kind of what happens is you're taking away the right to that social learning component. It's making it more unnatural. So again, just thinking about things that might be set up in place that usually they're very, very well intentioned, but want to examine more closely and say, is this restrictive? Is this creating unnecessary restrictions for people? And now I'll turn it back to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Laura. Now we're going to talk a little bit about rights committees. Having a system in place for thorough, unbiased review of potential restrictions in people's lives is of the utmost importance because people should not have their rights taken away simply because they have a disability. Many people in the Q&A put that choice and freedom were important to them. Can you imagine, though, having those things taken away from you many times simply because you have a disability? And we want to avoid that. Some good examples of things that we've seen when it comes to rights committees are committees that ask a lot of questions. Any kind of rights committee that meaningfully challenges the organization it is there to support. The Rights Committee really truly is there to support organizations. They are there to advocate with and for people. And so it is their job to meaningfully challenge an organization and ask lots of questions in order to ensure that people aren't being unfairly restricted. Another great example of something we've seen is people being invited to speak on their own behalf. What's fantastic is when we see that people receiving services are able to communicate for themselves at rights committee meetings where their information is being discussed. And if the person chooses not to attend after an informed discussion, then giving them the option of someone else attending to speak on their behalf. So essentially, giving them the information they need to know about what the committee is going to be reviewing, giving them the option to attend to speak on their own behalf. And if they choose not to attend, then giving them the option to send information with a trusted person to let the committee know if there's something specific they want the members to know about what they are reviewing for that person. Um, Another thing is inviting frontline supervisors to attend rights committee meetings. One of our CQL staff, who also works for a provider, said that they invite frontline supervisors to attend rights committee meetings when there is someone that they work with whose rights are being reviewed. They are there to listen to the discussion and hear firsthand the guidance that the committee gives and the questions that the committee has about the restriction. This person said that several frontline supervisors have noted that they have a much better understanding of rights and restrictions than they had before they attended these meetings. Another great thing we see is when we see a well-trained rights committee. Um, a well-trained rights committee is knowledgeable about current best practices and about the organization. They are not only looking at individual rights and restrictions of each person receiving services, but they're looking at agency policy to ensure that they're not unknowingly restrictive. They're also knowledgeable about current best practices and have a very eclectic membership. So they have a diverse membership of people that can provide a lot of great information to the organization, depending on each person's area of expertise. Depending on the type of services provided, a rights committee may not be necessary. You think about something like maybe early intervention services or employment, where the type of services they provide, they're not placing any restrictions on anyone. What we have seen sometimes in those types of services or mental health services is organizations have a ethics committee. And that ethics committee then meets as needed when people they support or families need some guidance on a specific topic or area. And like Laura had said earlier, too, I think one of the most important things that we can see is an inventory of all restrictions. And this is important. I personally have watched two organizations do this, and this really helped them just take stock of what restrictions were out there, and both of them found restrictions that they were not aware of. They found restrictions that they weren't identifying as restrictions. They and this is how they started. They educated each other. So they had a small group, a small team within the organization. They educated each other on what rights restrictions were and what intrusive interventions were with CQL's help. They then went out and they looked at people's person-centered plans. They looked at behavior support plans. They looked at assessments. They looked at incident reports. They went to people's homes and talked to people to get their perspective on what they felt were restrictive interventions. And they also looked at different places people lived to see if there was anything that they could observe that maybe wasn't noted anywhere else. They then took all this information and they created a dashboard and they noted every single thing that they saw. And both organizations were able to immediately get rid of some just on the basis that they didn't even know some of them were still in place. Maybe because someone had lived there before that, needed that restriction, but had moved and that restriction never left with them. So, which we tend to see pretty frequently. So, an inventory of all restrictions and intrusive interventions is a good way to kind of see where are we at and what is going on and what can we eliminate right away and what can we work towards to eliminating in the future. And this takes us right into practices. And interestingly, when we were talking to a mother of someone with a disability and her daughter, um, she said, people don't seem to have the right to say no. And that's interesting because we see this routinely that people with disabilities don't seem to have the right to say no. The minute that they say no, it's considered non-compliance and it's a behavioral issue. Um, and that goes back to the Q&A box, how many people said that choice was, part of having a right to them. So, um, we want to make sure that people with disabilities have the right to say no and don't feel like they have to be compliant, for lack of a better word, because that also then doesn't teach them to really be assertive when they need to be and to advocate for themselves when they need to. And when it comes to things like abuse and neglect and exploitation, we don't want them to be compliant. We want them to be able to say no. That's a very, very important word when it comes to concerns of abuse or neglect. So, in practices, it's important that we teach people that they do have the right to say no. Of course, with that comes responsibility. Sometimes when we say no, we have to understand the responsibilities that come with that. Another thing in practice is, and Laura had mentioned this before, in policy, is learning what rights are most important to people. Because once you understand what rights are most important to people and what they understand about rights, and what's important to them and what support they need, then in practice you can implement that education and that support that's meaningful to each person at an individual level. So learning about those rights that are important to people is really, really, really important. Some examples that we learned about when it comes to practices and rights. Um, Privacy and choice were definitely some of the top two rights that were most important to people. Um, One example we learned is that there was an organization that was very tech focused, was doing a lot with technology, including a lot of technology to support people. And one woman wanted a Ring camera, and so she wanted that Ring camera, and so she had access to that on her own phone. It was controlled by her. It was not controlled by anybody else and was not being used as surveillance. And cameras are one of those things that we are seeing more frequently as an issue of privacy and the right to privacy. And we've been hearing more and more from people with disabilities that are living in places that have cameras in there that they don't like them. Now, not everybody says they don't like them. What we most common see and hear is that people don't really always have an understanding of why the cameras are even there. So, pay very close attention to the use of cameras. We hope that you don't. But just like this one organization, this woman wanted a Ring camera, and so she had access to it on her own phone. Another example that was shared with a CQL staff is, when staff listen to parents over what the person is saying that they want, and what essentially that felt like to them is saying that the person matters less. And so this goes in and teaching and talking about the limits of guardianship and what is the role of the guardian, and where those limits really lie. And a good option here is to have the advocacy group conduct that training. Another example here is having people supported, involved is the number one way to ensure that people are exercising their rights. At one organization, they have a very strong group of paid self-advocates who are subject matter experts who analyze all policies and practices to ensure that rights are at the forefront. They also do visits to people's homes in residential settings to look at unwritten rights restrictions and talk to people about rights. So anytime you have people supported and involved like this, it is definitely high impact. The right to be informed of staffing changes is extremely important. Because if not, it can create fear. Example, getting into a car with a stranger. It's not always on an organization's radar to share, but it really is a big deal. In fact, we learned from this mother and daughter a few weeks ago, they had a very specific example of this. And they said that this young lady one day had a new driver show up for day services an hour late. And the driver blew the horn, but the young lady wasn't comfortable getting on a bus with a driver she didn't know. So they called the day services, and then the provider proceeded to tell them that this was considered a behavior because she wouldn't get on the bus with this person that she did not know. But I think if we can put ourselves into other people's shoes, it might be easier to understand what she was thinking and why she made that decision. For people who receive supports with bathing or personal hygiene, not being able to select which staff support the person at what time and in what fashion those supports occur, it can really be seen, potentially as a violation of one's right to dignity and privacy. So if any one of us were receiving supports with bathing or personal hygiene, I think all of us would probably want to have a say in who is supporting us in that regard. I'm going to send it back over to Laura now.
Yes, absolutely. So some of the things that Elizabeth was just talking about really kind of naturally segue into this slide, which is kind of all about the unnoticed, or what we at CUQL sometimes call the hidden restrictions. And these are things or practices that are not always typically noticed as restrictive or intrusive. So the things like having unspoken rules in homes, like bedtimes or times that the kitchen is closed, or having alarms on doors. And as Elizabeth was talking about, sometimes things like these are in place because maybe it was for specifically a person that used to live there and has just continued to be in place. And there hasn't been an adequate review of, is that needed for the people that live there? Other things that are sometimes hidden are intentionally withholding information from people. So, hearing things like, well, of course they can turn the camera off, or of course they can have overnight visitors, but we've never told them that. So, really infringing on their right to have the appropriate information. And like Elizabeth was talking about with the cameras, people not really even understanding why they're there or how they're used is a pretty big issue. Other things that we have seen are areas that are for staff only. So things like having a staff only bathroom that people that are supported by the organization are not allowed to use and only staff are able to use it, or things that only staff are able to use, areas that only staff are able to use. And this also flows right into what Elizabeth talked to about with the not informing people. When staff are leaving, they're leaving someone's life. They could be very significant and they have no preparation about that happening. Or during accreditations, are people invited to be involved, or are they told to be involved? So this comes down to the use of language, of course, which, you know, sometimes hearing things like, I told them it was okay to go in the fridge, or they're allowed to do X, Y, or Z, or even talking over people or correcting people as they're talking, saying like, well, what you really mean is this, right? Language like that really supports a culture of restriction, a culture of, I have to ask permission about these things that are basic rights, and that you have power over me. And all of this is directly linked to respect. Rights are so closely linked to respect. So, best practice is that there's a sense that people receiving services are equal, that they have the same common courtesies as any person would have. Another area that comes up as sort of a hidden restriction that isn't always thought about is access to technology, or unequal access to technology. So, Things like this, having a cell phone or having internet. Is it common for every single staff person that works at an organization to have a cell phone, but very few of the people who are supported to have their own cell phone? Or none of them have their own cell phone? Obviously, this directly impacts their rights. Having a cell phone for many of us enables our right to connection. It enables our right to safety. It enables our right to free access of information. So, what's really important here is to consider this and think about how to support people to have equal access to technology and education about that technology and how to use it if that's needed. This also applies to assistive technology, of course. So, how do organizations advocate for and with people to obtain the assistive technology to enable them to live the lives that they want? And again, education is so important here so that people understand why that might be helpful to them, how it might help them accomplish things that would be helpful for them, and how to use it effectively. And then going on to the education and advancement of rights, I think this sort of ties into everything that we've already discussed today. I think in almost every section we talked about education. It is so vital and it's so important that it's done on a continuous basis. It's not a one and done, check it off the list item. It should be really embedded in the culture of the organization and ensuring that lots of things are present. So people have choices in all of their decisions. This includes, where they live, who they live with, the staff that work with them, where they work, understanding their medical diagnoses, if they have medical changes going on, who their doctors are, if they have appointments coming up. They're not just being carted back and forth with people talking over them and they're not being informed about things. Just choice in their daily routines, in what formats their plans are in. This can really apply to everything. It also applies to advocacy, of course. And first, really thinking about how to teach people to be assertive and to resolve conflicts in a respectful manner. Being intentional about this teaching. This is not a skill that everybody has. And so really thinking about how this teaching can go on. And it's not just for people supported. This is good. These are great skills for staff to have as well. Also looking at self-advocacy. So how can the organization develop self-advocacy groups in ways that are meeting regularly and are accessible to people? So thinking about having virtual options, particularly if the geographical spread of an organization is really large and people want to participate, but they're not able to get to the location. Thinking about that, and then also supporting people to connect to those external self-advocacy groups at the local level, at the state level, the national level, and also thinking about creating a culture where people are encouraged to advocate for other people too. And this can be, their friends, other people that receive services, but really anyone. We've seen and heard really great examples of people advocating for their friends for an accessible park that was nearby to their home or sidewalk repairs. Some people have really strong self-advocacy skills and others are maybe not as interested or they don't have as strong of skills. And so encouraging a culture where people are encouraged to advocate for other people is great too. This also applies kind of more broadly to everyone. So looking at rights promotion that's not only focused on disability specific areas. So rights promotion for all people. Again, great examples of having staff, people supported, and other stakeholders get involved in powerful advocacy within the broader community for things like advocating and addressing food insecurity, housing insecurity, health disparity. This kind of just teaches the overall advocacy tenets and promotes human rights for all people, makes it more inclusive, it's substantial, and relatable for everybody. And then lastly, going back to education, this is about education for everyone. So as I mentioned when we were talking about policies and as has kind of been mentioned over throughout this webinar, we want to think about proactively providing education to staff, to people who receive services, to families, to other people that are important in their lives, to stakeholders, and not waiting until there's an issue. Um, Elizabeth talked about situations in which maybe a family member might have a different viewpoint, or maybe they want to see something different happen than what the person has or what the person wants in their life. And if you wait until that moment to have education, it's not always as impactful because it's kind of charged with a lot of emotion. So thinking about providing that education proactively before there's that tension and the emotions get brought into it. And always thinking about a variety of ways to provide that education. So a lot of really cool creative things that we've seen, great examples of using videos where people supported are telling their stories on video, talking about their own lives, and being able to use that for training on an ongoing basis. And also thinking about how can you kind of have this reflective piece for when people are learning about rights. So asking them what rights are important to them or what rights mean to them, kind of like we started out this webinar. Bringing that conversation inward is helpful to just bring awareness to what we even think about rights, and to bring that empathy. Can also think about doing side-by-side training of staff with people supported, because again, everyone needs to be trained. And there's a great learning component that can happen between staff and people supported when they're getting side-by-side training, or having people supported, like Elizabeth was talking about, having paid self-advocates to provide some of that training, whether it's about the Human Rights Committee or it's about going into people's homes and talking to them about what might be going on that might feel restrictive. Lots of different things. Fielding concerns or complaints. There's a lot of different ways that they can be involved in that. And then, as I mentioned before, really helping staff to understand how to help support people exercising their rights, not just what their rights are. And so we have seen some really nice things that organizations have created, like a guidebook that kind of has like what the different rights are, what the responsibilities are associated to that, how to support people, and then examples of teaching or activity ideas. So just for example, this one of the activity ideas for freedom of religion was, okay, could we invite some guest speakers or interview people that have different beliefs and non-beliefs to talk about it? So then people can learn about their freedom of religion and then explore that a little bit more with staff. Or, you know, contacting various religious leaders, including tribal leaders, to see what options are available in their area and maybe if they would connect with people within their own home or in their close community. So just really giving tangible examples that people can use in regards to how to support people to exercise their rights. And then, as we've talked about a few different times, really making sure there's thorough training about restrictions and what the Human Rights Committee is at all levels within the organization. So not just the direct support professionals, even admin staff, everybody should be involved and aware of that, because it helps you be more, helps people be more aware of if there is something that's going on that maybe could be restrictive, they can bring that to someone and have that get looked at. And that brings us to, what does the data say about rights? As most of you probably know, CQL is a data-driven organization, and in our latest personal outcome measures benchmarks report, outcome correlations were reviewed. And outcome correlations examine which outcomes have the greatest impact in predicting overall quality of life. And people exercise rights was number one. So ultimately, if people exercise rights, if that's present, it has the biggest impact on every other aspect of a person's life. The ones following that, after people exercise rights, where people are treated fairly, people interact with other members of the community, and people are respected. And on this slide that's up right now, you can see there's high correlation between all of these. So if people exercise rights, they're more than 8 times more likely to be respected. Again, that really, really close link with respect. They're more than 5 times more likely to decide when to share information. They're nearly 5 times more likely to have best possible health, and they're nearly 4 times more likely to be free from abuse and neglect. We'll turn it back over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Laura. The data is always really interesting. So it's just so amazing how truly rights has an impact on every single thing in a person's life. So we're going to finish off today with a couple things. Number one is talking about the Goldilocks rule. Um, People's rights are often linked, limited, or modified in the name of support or safety. So how do we find the right balance between too much and too little support? This is where we apply the Goldilocks principle. Support that's not too much, not too little, but just right. Here's the catch though, what's just right will look differently for every person, and even for the same person, it might change depending on the day, their energy levels, their environment, or the specific task. Finding that balance is not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing, responsive process. Here are a few strategies to help really calibrate that support. Number one, ask yourself, am I doing this for the person or with them? If you find yourself taking over or jumping ahead, then you need to pause. The best support happens with the person, not to them or on them. Invite them to participate, even if they need guidance or time. Offer just enough scaffolding to ensure success. Think of scaffolding like training wheels. You offer the support structure, but you're also planning to remove it gradually. Give enough help that the person can feel capable, but don't overdo it to the point that they feel like a bystander in their own life. Fade support at the person's pace, not yours. We often want people to progress quickly, but real empowerment happens when we let people build confidence and competence at their own speed. Fade support only when they're ready and always with their input. Check in and observe. Good support isn't just about strategy, it's about connection and communication. Ask open-ended questions and watch for signs of frustration, disengagement, or hesitation, and adjust as needed. The more you tune into the person, the better you'll be able to meet them in that just right zone. And be flexible. What worked last week might not work today. Someone might need hand-over-hand support for a new task, but only need verbal cues after some practice. Be ready to increase, decrease, or change the type of support based on real-time feedback. Ultimately, the goal of the Goldilocks approach is to empower the person to have ownership over their life. That means creating opportunities for growth, offering support without control, and always respecting the person's right to make choices, including mistakes. Autonomy doesn't mean independence in everything. It means having a say in how and when support is given. That's the kind of support that truly honors the dignity of the person. And we'll leave you with this last comment, if you will. Human rights are the foundation of diversity, equity, and inclusion. They provide a framework for protecting individuals from discrimination and ensuring fairness and respect for all. By championing human rights in workplaces, communities, and institutions, we create a more just and inclusive world. Upholding these principles is not just a legal or ethical obligation. It is a commitment to dignity, freedom, and equality for all. So we always like to say, sign up for CQL email so you can get all our resources sent straight to you. And of course, connect with us on all our social media accounts. This includes, on Facebook, our e-community, where you can share resources and connect to our partners. It's a great resource to share with others, to learn from others. A lot of great things going on the Facebook e-community. So that comes to the end of our presentation. Seth, do we have any questions in the Q&A box?
We do. We have just a few, and I know we don't have a whole lot of time left until the end of our hour together. But first question, do you have any tips on working with guardians or family members who may be pushing back on people exercising their rights?
Um, we get asked this a lot. And of course, I would love to have Laura jump into. What I can say is it's just ongoing education and support. You have to remember the family's perspective. They are the family, they are the guardian. So we want to come at it from a collaborative manner. Um, but making sure that it's understood that if you're providing supports to the person with a disability as an organization, that you're committed to helping them become their best selves, and they can only do that by understanding and exercising rights. It takes a long time for some people. I would also say that sometimes other family members who are really good advocates and who have done a lot with their loved ones are really great to share information with other family members. Sometimes family members just are more likely to listen to other family members than an organization. So, yeah.
That was exactly what I was going to say. And the other thing I think can sometimes be helpful, and of course, I think organizations are really great at knowing their audience, and they're really good at navigating these kind of trickier situations, but sometimes the data can really be helpful. Showing that, when people exercise rights, they are less likely to experience abuse and neglect. That can, because there's a lot of this whole idea around safety, but actually, if people are exercising rights, they're less likely to have abuse and neglect present in their life. So, but I agree with everything Elizabeth said.
Yeah, agree. Good, very good point, Laura. Yeah.
And then we do have another question. How do you protect rights like having visitors during late hours when multiple people live together?
I think this goes back to what Laura had talked about teaching people conflict resolution. Anybody that in their life that has ever lived with anybody else knows that you have to learn conflict resolution, or it's probably not going to be a good living situation. So I think the same thing is the case here. Those people living in the home, they need to come to the agreement on what works, what doesn't work for them. It shouldn't be dictated by the organization or by the staff. It should be the people living there, and then the staff just support them as needed. So,
Very good. Look at the Q&A. We get another question. Do you have any best practices for having people supported to be a part of the education and training about rights? I think you covered it a little bit, but maybe you kind of elaborate on it.
some of the best things I've seen is people who are involved in new hire orientation, not just in classes on rights, but classes on abuse, neglect, on classes on dignity, respect, just anything that they can be a part of to share their lived experience with new people coming in. Training their staff on their person-centered plans, if they utilize a behavior support plan, training staff on their plan of behavior supports and their preferences is really, really important. I know Laura and my maybe you can take over for me with ongoing training for staff.
Yeah, I think, like we talked about, I mean, involving people, everyone's skills and interest in this is different, but if people are interested in that ongoing training, looking at can they be paid to provide that training? Is there a way to involve them? And again, not just in the trainings that are specific to rights, because rights impacts everything in their life. So everything that can be looked at, and then including, that how staff are brought into the organization, how they're recruited, all of that, I think can really be a great way to involve people on an ongoing basis.
Yeah. And Laura, you had said before too, this can be through a video. I mean, if a
Yeah.
person doesn't want to attend a new hire orientation once a month, but they're willing to be part of a video where they talk about rights, they talk about what respect means to them, that can be just as powerful.
Seeing some really cool things that some organizations are doing too around not just training for staff, but training for the community. I mean, really teaching people about disability awareness and bringing that to, other businesses and other organizations in the community, and that being really impactful as well, through videos specifically.
Well, really good questions from attendees, really good answers from our presenters. So we're at the top of the hour. We want to be respectful of everyone's time. So thank you to everyone who took an hour out of their day to spend it with us. We do have some upcoming sessions in our accreditation webinar series. I put a link into the chat box for those. I'd also like to thank our presenters, Elizabeth and Laura. And for any of those that did not receive an answer to questions, we will work to answer those separately. So we do appreciate everyone joining us and look forward to seeing you again for future sessions soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Everybody.